What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved and respected actors faces off against a talk show host who pushes too far? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to find himself in the crosshairs of increasingly aggressive questioning that crosses every professional boundary. Tonight's explosive confrontation left audiences stunned, social media in chaos, and an entire television studio in complete shock. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two entertainment industry titans clash in the most uncomfortable television moment of the year. The evening started like any other taping at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio. Harrison Ford, the legendary star of Indiana Jones and Star Wars, had arrived to promote his latest project, looking every bit the seasoned professional in his dark blazer and signature slightly rumpled appearance that fans have come to love. The 81-year-old actor settled into the guest chair with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of handling press interviews, though those familiar with Ford knew he'd never been one to suffer fools gladly. Kimmel opened the interview with his typical theatrical energy, flashing that practiced smile to the cameras before turning his attention to his guest. Harrison Ford, everybody. The man, the myth, the legend. The audience erupted in the kind of enthusiastic applause reserved for true Hollywood royalty, and Ford offered a modest wave and that characteristic half-smile that had charmed audiences for generations. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Ford said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had delivered some of cinema's most iconic lines. There was a warmth there, but also something else, a slight edge that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable being there. "Oh, we're thrilled to have you here," Kimmel replied, though his tone carried an undertone that felt more predatory than welcoming. "I have to say, you look great for someone who's been in this business as long as you have. What is it now, like 50 years? Ford's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Something like that," he replied carefully, and anyone watching closely could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the comment hadn't landed well. Kimmel pressed forward, seemingly oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the subtle warning signs. "I mean, you've been around since the 70s, right? That's incredible longevity. A lot of actors from your era have. Well, let's just say they've stepped back from the spotlight." The studio audience began to sense something was off. The energy in the room shifted slightly, that electric feeling when a conversation starts to veer into uncomfortable territory. Ford's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his hands clasping together in his lap in a gesture that those who knew him recognized as a sign of growing irritation. "I'm still here, Jimmy," Ford replied, his voice maintaining its steady tone but with a slight chill that hadn't been there moments before. "Still working. Still enjoying what I do." But Kimmel wasn't reading the room, or perhaps he was and simply didn't care. Right, of course. And speaking of still working, I have to ask about some of the comments you've made recently about the film industry. You've been pretty vocal about how things have changed, haven't you? Some might say you've been a bit critical." Ford's jaw tightened slightly. "I think any honest assessment of where we are compared to where we were shows significant changes." "Yes, significant changes," Kimmel repeated, leaning forward with that expression he wore when he thought he was about to land a particularly clever point. "You know, some people might interpret your comments as being out of touch. I mean, the industry has evolved. It's become more inclusive, more diverse. Are you saying that's a bad thing?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Ford's expression darkened, and for the first time since sitting down, he looked directly at Kimmel with the kind of intensity that had made him perfect for playing characters who didn't back down from a fight. "That's not what I said, and that's not what I meant," Ford replied, his voice carrying a warning that any reasonable person would have heeded. "If you're going to quote me accurately." Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, though it looked more forced now. "Hey, I'm just asking questions here, Harrison. Isn't that what we do in interviews? I mean, you're a public figure. You put your opinions out there." "I'm a public figure, yes," Ford interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "But I'm not a punching bag for whatever narrative you're trying to construct here tonight." The studio audience was now visibly uncomfortable. The usual relaxed atmosphere of a late-night talk show had evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Camera operators glanced nervously at each other, unsure whether they should keep rolling or look away from what was clearly becoming a disaster. Kimmel, however, seemed to interpret Ford's pushback not as a warning, but as an invitation to dig deeper. Look, I'm not trying to create any narrative. I'm just pointing out that some of your recent interviews have raised eyebrows. You've talked about how scripts aren't as good as they used to be, how actors today don't have the same work ethic. Show me where I said that, Ford demanded, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades of experience dealing with Hollywood nonsense. Show me exactly where I said any of that. The challenge hung in the air, and for the first time since the interview began, Kimmel looked genuinely caught off guard. His research team had clearly compiled a series of talking points designed to provoke, but when pressed for specifics, the foundation of his accusations began to crumble. Well, I mean, it's the impression that comes across when you. Kimmel started, but Ford cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. The impression that comes across, Ford repeated, his voice heavy with disgust. So you're not actually quoting me. You're interpreting me. And then you're attacking me based on your interpretation. The studio had gone dead silent. Even the house band seemed frozen, their instruments forgotten as they watched one of Hollywood's most respected figures systematically dismantle the host's credibility in real time. Kimmel's face flushed slightly. And that's when he made the decision that would define the rest of the evening. Instead of backing down, instead of acknowledging the legitimate grievance Ford had raised, he doubled down. Harrison, come on, don't be so sensitive. This is just conversation. This is what we do here. You knew what you were signing up for when you agreed to come on the show. The words hit Ford like a slap across the face. His expression went from irritated to genuinely angry, and suddenly the comfortable talk show setting felt more like a boxing ring moments before the first punch. Is thrown. Sensitive, Ford repeated, his voice dropping to that dangerous low register that anyone who had ever worked with him knew meant trouble was coming. You ambush me with mischaracterized quotes, attack my professionalism, question my relevance, and when I call you out on it, I'm being sensitive. What happened next would become the moment that defined not just the interview, but Kimmel's reputation as a host. Instead of de-escalating, instead of showing even a shred of professional courtesy to a guest who had graced his show with his presence, Kimmel made a choice that would prove to be catastrophic, and that's when the real fireworks began. Kimmel leaned back in his chair with that smirk that had become his trademark, the one that suggested he was about to deliver what he thought was a devastating blow. You know what, Harrison? Maybe this is exactly the problem. Maybe this is why people are saying you've become difficult to work with. You can't handle a simple question without getting all worked up. The studio went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Ford's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, disbelief, and then something much more dangerous. His hands, which had been clasped in his lap, slowly unclenched, and he placed them flat on the armrests of his chair like a man preparing to stand up and walk away. Difficult to work with, Ford repeated slowly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned directors nervous on set. That's interesting, because in 50 years of making movies, I've never had a single director, producer, or co-star go on record saying I was difficult to work with. But you, Jimmy, sitting behind your desk with your writers feeding you questions designed to embarrass your guests, you think you know something about my work ethic? Kimmel's confidence wavered for a moment, but he pushed forward with the reckless determination of someone who had crossed a line and decided the only way out was to cross more lines. Hey, I'm just reporting what I hear. There are stories out there, Harrison. Stories about you being, let's say, particular about how things are done on set. Stories, Ford said, his voice dripping with contempt. What stories? From who? Give me names, Jimmy. Give me specifics. Because if you're going to sit there and attack my professional reputation, you'd better have something more substantial than gossip and innuendo. The camera operators were now getting signals from the control room, frantic gestures indicating they should keep filming despite the obvious discomfort of everyone involved. This was television gold, but it was also a career-ending disaster unfolding in real time. Kimmel's research team had clearly prepared him for pushback, but not for this level of systematic dismantling of his entire approach. He glanced quickly at his cards, looking for something, anything, that might give him back control of the situation. Look, I don't want to get into specific names, Kimmel said, trying to sound reasonable while completely missing how unreasonable his entire line of questioning had become. But there are industry publications that have mentioned your perfectionist tendencies, your need to control every aspect of a production. Ford's laugh was sharp and humorless. Perfectionist tendencies. That's what we're calling professionalism. Now, Jimmy, let me ask you something. When you do this show, do you just wing it? Do you come out here without preparation, without caring whether the jokes land or the interviews go well? Of course not. But nothing, Ford interrupted, his voice rising. You prepare because you're a professional. You care about the product you're putting out because your name is on it. That's not being difficult, that's being responsible. And if you can't tell the difference between those two things, then maybe you're in the wrong business. The audience was now visibly squirming in their seats. What had started as excited anticipation for a fun celebrity interview had turned into something much more uncomfortable. A public evisceration of their host by one of Hollywood's most respected figures. That Kimmel's face was flushed now, and his famous quick wit seemed to have abandoned him entirely. Instead of gracefully changing the subject or finding a way to defuse the situation, he made another catastrophic decision. You know what, Harrison? I think you're proving my point right. Now, you're sitting on my show, in front of my audience, and you're lecturing me about professionalism while having what basically amounts to a tantrum. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ford went completely still, his expression shifting from angry to something much more dangerous, the kind of cold fury that comes from being pushed beyond any reasonable limit. A tantrum, Ford repeated, his voice now deadly quiet. You invite me onto your show under the pretense of promoting my work. Then you ambush me with mischaracterized quotes, question my professionalism, suggest I'm difficult to work with based on unnamed sources and gossip, and when I defend myself, you call it a tantrum. Ford slowly began to remove the small microphone clipped to his lapel, his movements deliberate and controlled. The gestures sent a wave of panic through the production team, who realized they were watching their show implode in real time. Jimmy, Ford continued, his voice carrying the weight of 5 decades in Hollywood. I've been in this business since before you were born. I've worked with the best directors, producers, and actors in the world. I've been part of some of the most successful films in cinema history. And in all that time, I've never encountered the level of unprofessional behavior I'm witnessing from you tonight. Kimmel's desperate attempt to salvage the situation only made things worse. Harrison, come on, don't be like this. We're just having a conversation here. This is entertainment. The audience is enjoying it. Ford glanced out at the audience, many of whom were now looking distinctly uncomfortable, some even appearing embarrassed on behalf of their host. Are they? He asked quietly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they're watching you humiliate yourself on national television. The production staff in the control room were now in full panic mode. Signals were being sent to cut, to commercial, but the train wreck was so compelling that no one wanted to miss what would happen next. This was the kind of moment that would be replayed on social media for years to come. Kimmel, cornered and desperate, made one final attempt to regain control. You know what, Harrison? Maybe you should just relax. Have a drink. Loosen up a little. You're supposed to be here to have fun, not to give me a lecture about how the entertainment industry should work. The condescending tone was the final straw. Ford finished removing his microphone and placed it carefully on the small table beside his chair. When he looked up at Kimmel, his expression was one of complete disgust. Have a drink, Ford repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible throughout the silent studio. You think this is about me needing to relax? You think the problem here is that I'm not loose enough? Ford slowly stood up from his chair, his full height suddenly making the sitting host look small and diminished. The power dynamic in the room shifted completely, and suddenly it was clear who commanded respect and who had just revealed themselves to be a petty bully. Let me tell you what I think the problem is, Jimmy, Ford said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his legendary career. I think the problem is that you've gotten so comfortable attacking people from behind your desk, protected by your writers and your producers and your audience, that you've forgotten what it means to show basic human decency to your guests. The studio was now so quiet that the sound of Ford's breathing was audible. Every camera was trained on him, capturing what would become one of the most memorable moments in late-night television history. You've built your career on making people uncomfortable, Ford continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. On ambushing them with gotcha questions and then acting like they're the problem when they don't appreciate being humiliated. For your entertainment. Kimmel tried one last desperate interruption. Harrison, I think you're overreacting. Don't, Ford said sharply, holding up a hand that stopped Kimmel mid-sentence. Don't tell me I'm overreacting. Don't tell me I'm being sensitive. Don't tell me I need to relax. You crossed a line tonight, Jimmy, and the fact that you can't even see it tells me everything I need to know about what kind of person you really are. The tension in the room was now unbearable. Production assistants were frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or simply document what was clearly becoming a defining moment in their host's career. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnesses to something that felt more like a reckoning than an interview. And that's when Harrison Ford made the decision that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Ford turned away from Kimmel and looked directly into the main camera, his piercing blue eyes seeming to bore through the lens and into the homes of millions of viewers. When he spoke, it wasn't to the host anymore. It was to America itself. Ladies and gentlemen, Ford said, his voice carrying the gravitas that had made him one of cinema's most commanding presences. I came here tonight to talk about my work, to connect with fans, and to show respect for the craft that has been my life for 5 decades. Instead, I've been subjected to a series of personal attacks disguised as entertainment. Kimmel, realizing he was losing complete control of his own show, tried desperately to interject. Harrison, please, let's just. Ford's head snapped toward him with the intensity of a gunfighter in an old Western. No, Jimmy, you've had your say. You've had your fun. Now it's my turn. The authority in Ford's voice was absolute. Even Kimmel, surrounded by his own staff and his own audience, fell silent under the weight of it. Ford turned back to the camera. And when he continued, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had thought carefully about every word. This man invited me here under false pretenses. He prepared ambush questions based on mischaracterized quotes and industry gossip. When I challenged him to provide specifics, he couldn't. When I defended my professionalism, he called it a tantrum. When I stood up for my reputation, he told me to have a drink and relax. The studio audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Many of them had their phones out, recording what they instinctively knew was a historic moment in television. But here's what really bothers me. Ford continued, his voice gaining strength. It's not just about me. It's about what this represents. It's about a culture where tearing people down is considered entertainment, where ambushing guests is considered good television, where basic human decency is apparently too much to ask for. Kimmel made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Harrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I never intended, Jimmy, Ford interrupted, his voice cutting through the host's protests like a blade. Your intentions don't matter. Your impact does. And your impact tonight has been to demonstrate to millions of people that you're willing to sacrifice a guest's dignity for what you think makes good television. Ford began walking toward the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The cameras followed him, capturing every step of what was clearly a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed. You know what the tragedy is. Here, Jimmy, Ford said, pausing at the edge of the stage. You had one of the great privileges in entertainment, the chance to sit down with people who have dedicated their lives to this craft and learn from them. Instead, you chose to use that privilege to tear them down. The host's famous quick wit had completely abandoned him. He sat behind his desk looking small and diminished, his usual confidence replaced by the dawning realization that he had just been thoroughly and publicly humiliated by one of Hollywood's most respected figures. Ford's voice carried a note of genuine sadness as he continued. I've been in this business long enough to know that not everyone is going to like me or my work. That's fine. That's part of the job. But there's a difference between honest criticism and what you did here tonight. What you did was character assassination, pure and simple. Members of the audience began to murmur among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Ford's assessment. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had started as Kimmel's show was now Ford's stage, and he was delivering a masterclass in dignity under fire. You want to know what being difficult really looks like, Jimmy? Ford asked, his voice carrying just a hint of the iconic Han Solo smirk. Being difficult is accepting an invitation to appear on someone's show and then having to endure a hack job like this. Being difficult is sitting here listening to you attack my character while pretending it's all in good fun. Ford reached the steps leading down from the stage and paused, looking back at Kimmel one final time. But you know what? I'm not going to be difficult anymore. I'm going to make this very easy for everyone involved. The studio held its collective breath as Ford began descending the steps. Each footfall echoed in the silence like a judge's gavel, final and irrevocable. I'm leaving, Ford announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. Not because I can't handle criticism, not because I'm throwing a tantrum, but because I have too much respect for myself and for this industry to sit here and pretend that what just happened was acceptable. Kimmel, desperate to prevent the complete collapse of his show, stood up from behind his desk. Harrison, wait. Don't go. We can work this out. Ford stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned back, his expression a mixture of pity and disgust. Work it out? Jimmy, you spent the last 20 minutes systematically attacking everything I've built over 5 decades in this business. You questioned my professionalism, my character, and my relevance. And now you want to work it out. The silence that followed was deafening. Ford's words hung in the air like an indictment, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Let me give you some free advice, Ford said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had navigated Hollywood's treacherous waters for half a century. The next time you have a guest on your show, try treating them with the same respect you'd want to be treated with. Try asking questions that actually relate to their work instead of setting traps designed to humiliate them. Try being a host instead of a bully. Ford turned toward the exit, then paused once more. And Jimmy? The next time you want to question someone's professionalism, take a long look in the mirror first. With that, Harrison Ford walked out of the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio, leaving behind a host whose reputation would never fully recover, an audience that had witnessed television history, and a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel stood alone on his stage, looking out at an audience that had just watched him get systematically dismantled by one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before someone in the control room finally had the mercy to cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media like wildfire. The hashtag Harrison Ford walkout began trending immediately, with millions of viewers sharing their own footage of the legendary actor's devastating takedown of the talk show host. The incident would go down as one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history, a masterclass in how not to treat your guests, and a reminder that even in Hollywood, there are still people who refuse to be bullied for the sake of entertainment. Harrison Ford had walked into that studio as a guest promoting his latest project. He walked out as a legend who had reminded everyone watching what dignity looked like, even in the face of public humiliation. And Jimmy Kimmel? He was left to pick up the pieces of a reputation that would never be quite the same again. The king of late-night television had been dethroned, not by a rival host or a network executive, but by an 81-year-old actor who simply refused to accept that being disrespected was part of the job. It was a lesson in professionalism that millions of viewers would never forget, delivered by a man who had just proven that true star power isn't about being untouchable. It's about knowing when to walk away.